Thank you for joining us today. We are sitting down with Ann Nelson from the Minnesota Department of Health to talk about private wells and what do we need to know. Um, my name is Miranda Wagner, and I'm the agricultural conservationist with the Sherburne Soil and Water Conservation District. And I'm going to hand it off to you right away, Ann, and you can control the slides and teach us all about private wells.
Perfect. Thanks, Miranda. All right. We're going to kind of generally talk about how healthy is your well. So, really focusing specifically on private wells. Again, my name is Ann Nelson. I am the Partner Engagement Communication Specialist at Department of Health. So, I focus mostly on education and outreach to private well users in Minnesota. And a little overview of what we'll discuss. So, well construction, what a well typically looks like, which I think you've seen previously. Groundwater protection, some things you can do to protect your well water quality, and then, of course, well water testing. So, just a reminder, just another visual of what a newer well looks like. So, you'll have that weatherproof gasket and cap at the top of the well. You want at least that foot above clearance above the ground, and then you should have a well ID tag on your well. Again, sometimes these do fall off. Um, that's okay, but it is a good source of information for you and for folks in the future.
What happens if your well ID tag falls off? Where are those kept if you needed to find it again?
Yeah, yeah. So sometimes they get bumped or missed, or if your well is serviced, sometimes they come off that way. There's a variety of ways. It's not detrimental. It's more of just a source of information, just identifying that well. If you don't have it there, you don't know where it went, maybe you bought the home and there wasn't a tag on there, you can call a licensed well contractor. There should be some records out there if your well has been established after 1974, which is when we started keeping records of wells. So, not that big a deal, but it's a nice thing to have there for future owners. So looking again, a different way of looking at a newer well, you can see in this schematic here, it's a general idea of what a newer well in Minnesota looks like. It's a sand and gravel well. These are really common in Minnesota. There are several different other types, but in the Sherburne County area and the Central Sands area, this is mostly what you're going to find. So you have that gasket at the top, that PVC pipe for your electrical, and then your well casing here above the ground. Underneath that, you're going to have your pump all the way down. So this can be 50, 100, 150 plus feet. Just depends on your area. They'll drill down into a sand and gravel aquifer. Um, so quite a ways down. And then you'll have the pump. You'll have your pump screen. So this is full of different size little slats. That's where the water will come in. They'll pack sand and gravel around here, really coarse textured. And that's so this fine sand and gravel can't get into your water and into your well and then pumped back into your house. So we have a line into the house, we have electrical conduit, and then we just have casing. We have grout above that coarse sand and gravel, and that really just keeps this coarse textured sand and gravel in place. So it doesn't go up, it doesn't go down, things from the surface don't come down. So that's kind of how they're formed in a very basic sense in Minnesota. For older wells, so some people still have these. Hopefully, you're not one of those people that has a piston pump in their basement. So really, you can think of these wells as like a giant plunger. So this pump just goes up and down here and pumps water up into the house. So usually we find these in the basement. Again, just a really older style of well. And then we also have a dug well or a pit well. So really this, I think, is what we think of when we think of maybe the 1800s or earlier, where they just dug a hole in the ground and finally you get down to water. You keep digging a little more and then you take your water from there. So these are still around. We like them to be sealed. And then you'll usually see like a cap over the top of these things which is good for safety because we don't want children, dogs, rodents falling into these things. They are a big safety hazard if left open. And then also they're a big contamination hazard because we can get rain and chemicals and again rodents falling in there. And then those get into the water and then spreads into the groundwater. So if you have one of these on your property, highly suggest that you seal those.
Do you see a difference, or have you seen over the years of working this position, a difference in the depth of wells that you see between newer and older wells?
Yeah, so when we say older wells, we think of before 1974 when we had regulations on construction of wells. And really, it was kind of the Wild West. You can have your buddy come over and you could dig your own sandpoint well, whatever you wanted. So some of those wells are around 20 feet, 10 feet. Really, once you hit water, and then you go a little bit deeper to make sure you have some consistency. Nowadays, around the Sherburne area, the Central Sands area, they're about 150 feet plus. So I'd say between 100 and 200 feet. It just really depends on where you are, what the bedrock is
Mhm.
like. So we want at least one layer of bedrock or some sort of confining layer. But in the past, people just kind of went to the nearest spot where they could find consistent water and left it there.
And
So it just really depends. I would say around
mhm.
150 feet for newer wells.
Okay. And what's you brought up Sandpoint wells, and I know quite a few of them still exist in Sherburne County. And so luckily when I talk to someone, usually it's used for their garden, or it's just not being used for human consumption. Can you
Yeah,
talk a little bit about why we shouldn't be using Sandpoint wells for human consumption?
absolutely. So we know Sandpoint wells are usually pretty shallow, maybe around 50 feet or less. And when you get shallow wells like that, it's really easy for the water to become contaminated with nitrates, with pesticides, chemicals, anything that's on the surface is really easily able to get into your water supply. So you don't have a lot of protections when you have a sandpoint well. And that's really the main reason is that you can get sick from these wells pretty quickly because of the contamination potential. So when we talk about groundwater, a couple of definitions. So groundwater is the water that's in the soil or bedrock area. It's not really a lake underground. I think we were maybe taught that maybe in middle school, but that's not how most of it works. It's really just water in between sand and gravel particles in the underground. And then the aquifer is the same thing. So that's the water that is transmitted in the soil or rocks. And then a confining layer is a really dense rock, um, some type of soil, so like clay, that really restricts water movement. So it can take several hundred years for water to move between confining layers or between aquifers if there's a confining layer in there.
In Sherburne County, what do you usually see as a confining layer or on the central sands?
Yeah. So unfortunately, I'm not the best person to ask, but I know around St. Cloud we have a lot of granite. So there is layers of granite that will be in there that we have to drill through. Otherwise, we'll get layers of shale, which is like silt and sand confined, or like a really hard layer of that and a really thick layer. And so water has a really hard time moving through those. But so a licensed well contractor, they will know what those things are in your area since they drill all the time. Good question. So looking at the hydrologic cycle, like how do we get groundwater? And how does it go from the surface all the way down? How long does it take? So when we look at this, so we have our lake, we get evaporation from the lake that turns into precipitation, a good water cycle. We have runoff from the land, and then we have some infiltration. So everywhere below us, there's going to be a water table. So again, these shallow wells, if you just start digging, you're going to reach that water table and you'll find consistent water below that. That will flow into bodies of water, so the lake, and then of course we have our water table along underneath the soil here. We'll have a well for a house usually. This is called a cone of depression. So we're pumping that water. It takes time for the water to flow through the soil and the rocks underneath. That's why we get that cone of depression. And then underneath that, we'll have this bedrock. So this in its picture, like a fractured bedrock, which is something we'd see in the southeast part of the state. It can move through those cracks and and then go beneath that as well.
Before we move off this slide, talking about the cone of depression. So sometimes an issue that a well owner might find themselves in is what they call interference, well interference.
Mhm.
And it can come from a number of different sources. But if you do think that you have a well interference issue, you would call the DNR,
Yeah.
correct? Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
You
So
don't want that
Minnesota,
phone call.
no. So at Minnesota Department of Health, we really focus on the quality aspect of your water. Um, and so the DNR really is going to be the one that focuses on the quantity. So if you're running out of water, definitely the DNR is going to be your point person.
Thank
Good
you.
question. Yeah. All right. So looking more at, we talked about groundwater is really not this lake beneath the surface. Maybe there's some caves where you find water underground in the lake form, but most of the time it's going to be the water in between the pore spaces. So I really like to think of a jar of marbles, and that's the water that's in between those marbles is what you would find in groundwater. And then different contamination sources. So we know nitrate right now is really kind of a star child for quality issues, but we have a lot of other things that can help contaminate the water. Um, so right here we have our water table. We have a stream here. We have a couple different wells, so one from a farm and one from a house. So you can get contamination from abandoned wells. So if you have one on your property, sealing it is a great idea. There is money out there to help seal
Hmm.
wells. We can have some contamination from landfills. So really, we'd like to emphasize that newer landfills are pretty heavily regulated and tested, and our partners at the Pollution Control Agency monitor those really heavily. So if you're near one and you have questions, the MPCA can help answer some of those questions for you. Um, Another thing is septic systems. So failing septic systems can be a big source of bacteria mostly, and sometimes nitrates if they're really failing. And then also, of course, pesticides and fertilizers, we know are one as well.
And when we're working with landowners, usually in landscapes like this, we think of wells being in more rural areas. So a lot
Mhm.
of times we think, no, it's farm pesticide runoff, fertilizers, things like that. But we do a lot of education, and it's a good reminder that when you have something like a lake home, you are also just need to kind of watch out where your fertilizers and maybe pesticides are going, and then also
Mhm.
the septic systems. And we'll talk a little
Yeah.
bit more about setbacks later, but those are
Yeah.
things to think about as where your well is going to go on your property. And then also we're talking about private wells today, but we do like to remind folks that when you live in town, your city has a well. So everyone, you're drinking from, not everyone, but in Sherburne County, you're drinking from a well. It's just either personal or your city. So there are things even within our cities that we can do to protect the city well. Alternative
Yeah.
turfs, watering reduction, things like that.
Absolutely. Such a great point. Yeah, I think when we think of fertilizers and pesticides, those don't care if you're on a farm or if you're on a lake home or if you're just in a residential area putting some nitrogen on your grass. So, it doesn't differentiate between where you are.
Mhm.
Um, Also another thing, like I like that you brought up the city well. So at Department of Health, we have a huge program called our Source Water Protection Program. And those folks go to cities and they work with the city managers and the water operators to really focus on how can we protect that travel time around that city well. so it doesn't become contaminated for all the people that rely on that water. Fortunately, we don't have the same thing for private wells, so maybe one day we can get to a
Hmm.
point where we have a program for private well users to really help them think about their well and what they're putting on their land surface around that well to help protect that water for everyone. So it's a very great point.
Yeah, most of the cities in Sherburne County, probably all of them, they have wellhead protection plans that they're
Yeah.
working with MDH, but they're also working with Minnesota Rural Water, which gets some of their funding from MDH, and those are also really good folks to use as a resource
Yeah.
for drinking water questions.
Yes, absolutely. All right. So when we're looking at setbacks, that's just the distance between your well and other things around it. And so we have a whole list of setbacks. And if you're interested in that list, you can find that on our website. But for example, between the house and your private well, we want at least 3 feet. So it's not very far. But if you have a septic system, which if you have a private well, you also likely have a septic system. So for a regular residential household, that'd be about 50 feet. But if you have maybe a big business or like you're a party planner and you host parties at your place, it'll likely be more than 50 feet, around 300 feet. Other things you can think of, so like if you're on a lake home, we want at least 35 feet between that open body of water and your private well. And then, of course, if you're on a farm and you have some of these outbuildings, we have different setbacks depending on the type of building and what you're using it for, what you're storing in it. So if you have questions about that, again, it's on our website. Otherwise, a licensed well and boring contractor is also a great resource, and they will know all of these setbacks that you need to follow. So I have in my notes pool story. So in this picture, we have the in-ground pool. So if you're lucky enough to have an in-ground pool in Minnesota, we want at least 20 feet between the well and the in-ground pool. And the story I have is that somebody built their in-ground pool right behind their house, and then their well was behind that. And they didn't have very much space between the neighbor's property and theirs and their pool. So the well contractor, when they came out to service the well after 10, 15 years, whatever it was, had to build scaffolding over the pool to get to that well that was on the other side because they
Oh
couldn't
my
go in the neighbor's
goodness.
property. Yeah, so just being aware what you're putting in your yard and where your well is a good option when maybe you're able to put in that in-ground pool. So
Hmm.
some things to think about. Okay, so for drinking water, we know that water is a great solvent, right? It easily dissolves contaminants and carries them downward. Shallow wells, we talked about this, are really an easy source for contamination because water does not have to flow far to get to that entry point. And then we know that nitrate is the most common human controlled substance to contaminate groundwater and moves really easily. The good news, soil is a great filter. So the deeper your well, really the more protected you should be from really the human-made contaminants that travel easily. And then we know those confining layers, that clay, that granite, limits the downward movement by maybe several hundred years before that contaminant can move downward through that. So looking at some things you should pay attention to when you're looking at your well. So I talked about a couple of these in the little video, but we'll look more closely at a couple things. So that electrical conduit, so we talked about that may crack. So looking for cracks there, here's a few examples. It may not be super obvious, but there is a little gap here between the weatherproof cap and that electrical conduit PVC pipe. Things can get in there, travel down in this PVC pipe, or they can come up through that weather cap and go into the well. Again, same thing here. We tried, we tried in this photo, put some electrical tape on there to keep it held in, but also here is another example of a crack. So that is an entry point for things to get into your well. This wellhead vent and screen, some wells have these, some do not. It just depends on where you are and if there is a lot of gas in the water. which sounds odd.
Mm-hmm.
But there are some places where you need these to vent off gas from that aquifer, that water area. So if you don't have one, don't be alarmed. If you have one, we just say to make sure this mesh screen is intact. There's no holes, it's not pushed through, anything like that, because that also can be an entry point for things to go in. Or if it floods, can also be an entry point. So just look for that if you have one of those. And then the well casing and protection. So here's a really good example. You have a nice a nice roof over your well. Again, you don't need these things. You don't need them, but sometimes they look nice. But this is a huge gap, right? It's not even connected. This must have shifted and fallen in the soil or the bedrock a little bit. So that's a great point for rodents to get in there, and they'll die in the water, and then that's a source of bacteria in your water. So just be paying attention to those. Here's another example of a crack. You'll have to get these things fixed by a licensed well contractor. This one, the homeowner must have piled some boulders next to their well to either protect it. Maybe they didn't want to hit it with a lawnmower. Maybe they thought it was ugly, so we're going to hide it. You don't need to do those things if you don't want to. And there's really no ground clearance, so really things can just kind of walk over and fall right into the well if there is a crack. Also, if you need this well serviced, again, I don't think your well contractor is going to be very happy with you. So
No.
you don't need to do these things. A little landscaping is fine, but kind of leave the well alone. And then thinking about flooding. So this is just a pit where a well is. You can see the ladder here, but we've had some water come into this pit area and it can go into the well. Here's another example. This photo is very blurry. Sorry about that. But here's your well. It's a foot above the surface and you have some flooding in the background. Hopefully that flooding doesn't keep making its way up the shoreline, but this really helps protect your well from any sort of low flooding in the area.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so that's really why we have that 1 foot gap
It's
between the ground. Yeah,
Yeah, and it's good to remember that's why setbacks are in place from lakes. In Sherburne
exactly.
County, we do have some lakes that can jump in elevation,
Yeah,
water levels they're pretty flashy sometimes.
yeah,
So that's why those
yeah,
setbacks exist, so that
yeah,
we don't get flooding in our wells.
yeah. Okay, so testing. So this is our 24-hour message at MDH. We have 5 contaminants that we want you to test for. Coliform bacteria, nitrate, test those every year. Arsenic, lead, and manganese at least once. And if you have a young child in the home, it's not a bad idea to retest some of those things just to make sure. And then all of these, you can't see, you can't smell, and you can't taste any of them. So a lot of the complaints we get are my water stinks or my water's brown or things like that. A lot of those not big health concerns. Maybe if you have a lot of manganese, it'll do some staining. Um, so if you're just drinking a glass of clear water, there could be things in there that or could potentially harm your health. So really testing for at least all these 5 is really what we recommend and on a routine basis.
So besides doing this on your own, there are going to be some points in a well's life where they're going to be required to be tested. Can you go over some of those?
Absolutely. So the only time we require testing is at construction, and we test for coliform bacteria. That has to be negative or a non-detect before you can drink the water. So likely a well contractor will sanitize your well before you even drink it. Um, they also test for nitrate and arsenic. And so nitrate was 1992, we added that, and arsenic was 2008. And for those results, if they come back above the health risk limit, you get a letter saying, hey, you have this in your water at this level, you should consider treatment. And that's really what we get. After that, it's all up to the homeowner to do testing.
And there are some regulations at the county level. So if you are, I believe it's if you're a foster family or running a
Mhm.
daycare out of your home, you're going to be required to do a water test from a certified lab. And then I believe with the sale of your home, you would need to, I believe usually that's required in the sale of your home is that you would need to have a water test included.
Yeah, good point. So, absolutely, with if you're fostering, if you're adopting, you need to do those. If you're daycare, you are kind of classified as a special type of well. So we regulate those a little differently. And then at the property transfer, the only county we know of right now that has a formal law or ordinance is Dakota County. So that requires the property transfer testing. Everything else is kind of up to your mortgage company. So some
Hmm.
mortgage companies will require it, others don't. So if you are thinking about buying a home with a private well, I wouldn't be surprised if that's something you need to do as well. Good question. All right, so I'm going to go through some of the contaminants, clarify like the action level, when you need to test, why, how it'll make you ill. So coliform bacteria, this action level is if you have any detection of coliform bacteria, you should test for E. coli. So the health impacts, you don't get sick from coliform bacteria itself, but it is a really cheap, easy way for us to look for the presence of other bacteria and parasites that can make you sick. So mostly it'll be E. coli. And so you get that from warm-blooded animals, the waste of warm-blooded animals. Um, so usually that's from a failing septic, or maybe you have some dead animals around your well, unfortunately, or you're next to maybe a feedlot or something that's not working properly. So testing at least once a year. Again, the coliform bacteria doesn't really make you sick, but it's an indicator. And then test for E. coli. If you do find coliform bacteria in your well, um, so first of all, we say get your drinking water from another source while you're addressing the problem. And then inspect your well. Maybe you have a crack in your well where things are getting into and that needs to be repaired. Otherwise, maybe there's something next to your well that's dying, or you have animals around your area. So looking for those things and like removing the source is the best option. Otherwise, if you do find that and you disinfect your well, which we have some guidance on our website, so you can do that yourself if you want. You can have a licensed well contractor disinfect your well if you would like, and it's still coming back positive again and again. It's likely there's a crack in your well somewhere underground, and those can be repaired. You don't need a brand new well for some of those things, so keep that in mind.
I think it's a good point. Sometimes we go directly to, oh, I need to shock my well. And just really making, and I know it costs money to have a well
Yeah,
contractor come out, but it might save you a lot of time and money in the long run just to make sure that there's nothing that can be maintained or fixed.
right. Yeah. Yeah, usually we find it's just some sort of crack that you need fixed. So it can be a fraction of the price of a brand new well. For nitrates, our action level, which is our health risk limit, is 10 milligrams per liter or above. It's also 10 parts per million, same type of measurement. Our focus population really is infants. Bottle-fed infants under 6 months of age are at the highest risk, and that's called methemoglobinemia or blue baby syndrome. So it really affects how the oxygen is carried in the blood. The baby will turn blue and basically suffocate. So it can be fatal. It's not a huge, we don't, it's not a reportable disease in Minnesota, so we don't know the total number of cases that happen annually. But we know that there's been a lot of education and outreach around this. So we don't see a lot of even anecdotal cases, but it is something we want to be aware of. There are some research, we call them epidemiological studies, really making generalizations about populations in an area that are having some different health impacts from nitrate. But the science and the data is not there yet for us to feel comfortable changing that health risk limit to a lower value. So right now we really believe 10 parts per million, 10 milligrams per liter is protective of most populations. So the sources of nitrate, again, is mostly agricultural residential fertilizers, but also, we get it from feedlots and sewers, and failing septics. So again, testing every year. So where do we have the most nitrate problems? These graphs are a little bit old, but still a good representation of where we see most nitrate issues. So of course, it's going to be in the central sands. We kind of already knew that. And then again, in the southeast, we have a lot of issues. So these results are from the Minnesota Department township testing results. And so the red townships are 10% of the wells are over 10 parts per million. So concentrations mostly in the southeast and the central sounds. But again, if you have that shallow well and you're near a really heavy agricultural area, we really suggest testing for nitrate as well. If nitrate is above 10, again, get your drinking water from another source until you address the problem. We say don't let infants under 6 months who are bottle fed drink the water. Inspect your drinking water system. Again, like bacteria with nitrate, it can just be a crack in the system, in your casing, where things are getting water from the surface is getting in really quickly. So it doesn't mean you have to get a new well. And then removing some potential sources. So again, maybe that's you have a failing septic system, or maybe somebody left a bag of fertilizer right next to your well that's leaching into the ground. Who knows? So if you find some of these sources, remove those, and hopefully that helps with the issue. And then at the most, consider drilling a new well or getting a home water treatment system. So most people know to treat nitrate, you do a reverse osmosis system, but we also know there's some cheaper anion exchange systems, and a water quality treatment professional can help you make some of those decisions.
And it's important. I have this conversation many times a year. Do not boil water that is high in
Yes.
nitrate. It does not get rid of nitrates, it concentrates them further. So boiling water in this case is not going to help decrease nitrates in your water. It will do the opposite.
Yeah.
And then for getting your water tested once a year, it's always great to go to a certified lab, and those are listed on MDH's website. But we also host a number of nitrate clinics in Sherburne County every year. And we have equipment from MDA on loan that they let us use. And we do 3 a year, but we also have opportunities to have you drop off wells or well samples at the office too. Again, we only do nitrates, but if that's something that you're concerned about, we can get you a really good snapshot of where it is at that time. And I do wanted to add also, Anne, that nitrates can fluctuate throughout the year. Your water tests might look different at different times of the year. So it's keep tabs on it.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, maybe that's a thing where one year you test in the spring, the next you test in the summer, the next you test in the fall, just to get a good baseline of where that nitrate is at. That's a good recommendation. All right, so for arsenic, this is one where you test at least once, and then if you have a new well construction, they will test it for you. So our action level is 10 micrograms per liter. That's the same as 10 parts per billion. But really, we know with arsenic that any level, any detection, we suggest that you treat. So for the health impacts of arsenic, it's really a long-term exposure. You're not going to get sick right away from drinking high water with high arsenic in it one time. It's going to be over your lifetime. So we see really high increases of cancer, so bladder, lung, liver cancer, lower IQ in children, higher incidences of diabetes and heart disease. So I think we're going to talk about this in a little bit, but the sources, we say it's naturally occurring from the rocks and soils. There has been some in the past of, we used to put it in pesticides, we used to put it in wood preservatives. That's not really a thing anymore. So really our main source is just, it's in the soil, it's in the rocks, so it's already in the water. And then again, for testing at least once, and then when you're moving to a new location, we suggest testing again. So this comment, we met recently with a U.S. geological survey hydrologist, and we had this discussion of not saying naturally occurring anymore, moving
Mm-hmm.
to maybe a word like geogenic. So the idea that something natural couldn't hurt you is wrong. So we know that we have really strong evidence that arsenic causes these increased risks of cancer and diabetes and heart disease. And so really it's just in the soil. It comes from the rocks. It can make you sick. So just paying attention to that and moving away from Mother Earth would not harm you.
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
naturally occurring because it's geologically part of what
yeah,
we have in Minnesota.
yes, yes. So looking at where arsenic is found, it kind of depends. It's all over the place. So we really, regardless of where you are in Minnesota, we recommend testing for it. But we do kind of see some pattern between the last glaciation, so the Des Moines lobe, which you can see outlined in red, and where our high arsenic levels are. So it kind of follows the same pattern. Um, but there are spots where you can have a high arsenic that are outside of where this Des Moines lobe went. So, but mostly it's all over the state. We have a lot of really high arsenic kind of in the northwest area of the state, but again, all over. And really, if you find any detection, we suggest you treat, but if it's over 10 parts per billion, strongly suggest that you treat. So if your arsenic is detected, reverse osmosis is a good option. Distillation, which takes a lot of energy, but if you're interested in that type of system, that works really well. And then, of course, an adsorbative media iron oxide is most common. And so, again, a water treatment professional will really know the best option for you in your household. For lead, action level, any level of lead is unsafe. And we know that really well with research that we've done. And so it can affect really anybody. Babies, young children, pregnant women are the highest risk. And then it does damage the brain, the kidneys, nervous system, can slow development. And then the sources of this, so we know that arsenic really is just in the rocks. Um, and then lead is just from really human-made products. So older plumbing, it can be lead pipes, can be lead solder, it can be from the fixtures, so that you have an older faucet. It may be leaching out of these materials into your water. So it's not really found in the groundwater. It's really found in the home if you have an older home. And again, we moved away from these high lead fixtures really in the late 80s and into the 90s. And now we have a plumbing code. So that's managed by another agency. And they really inform how much lead can be in things and what materials can be in things. So if you have a newer home, shouldn't be a worry. Again, of course, I recommend testing anyways, but really for older homes built in the 80s or earlier than that can be a big thing. So testing at least once, especially if you're moving into an older home. If lead is detected, really you can kind of mitigate the effects of lead in your water fairly easily just by letting the water run for about a minute. Um, just because that water or that lead is leaching out of those pipes, it's getting into water that's sitting there. So if the water is continuously moving, you're not going to get so much of that leaching into the water from those pipes. So if you're really strapped and there's no way you can install a treatment system, that is a decent way to kind of protect yourself in the short term. And then, of course, using cold water for drinking, cooking. So we know hot water leaches lead from those pipes quicker than cold water. Um, and then if you're able to really replacing those lead components is the best option. Otherwise, a home water treatment system, again, reverse osmosis, distillation. There are some activated carbon pitcher filters that do a really great job of taking lead out. And then, of course, another alternate water source. For manganese, so we have two levels here. For children under one, the level is 100 micrograms per liter or parts per billion a day. And then for anyone older than one, it's 300 micrograms a liter. So manganese can cause deficits in memory, attention span, motor skills, and this is also a long-term exposure. So just not one glass of water is going to make you ill. It's going to be throughout your lifetime. And then, of course, again, this one is the same as arsenic. It's just manganese is in the soil, it's in the bedrock. So we can't really do much to lessen your exposure other than maybe drilling to a new aquifer. For testing, at least once, and then before baby drinks the water. So maybe in the past you had a level of 200, which was fine for adults in the household, but really testing again to make sure it's under that 100 if you're going to be bottle feeding your infants or, providing them water in a sippy cup before they're 1 year of age. So where's manganese found? Kind of all over. So we do have some hot pockets where it can be high. So this is detection. Really, these red is over 75% of the time you're going to find that manganese. So in the southeast, which is like the bedrock is a little different. We have a different geology, so you would have a lower incidence there, and then a little bit up in the northwest. But really, testing anywhere you are is a good recommendation. So if you find manganese at an unsafe level, again, get your drinking water from another source or use a different water source for baby. Maybe it's at that 200 parts per billion level, um, and you have a child under one in the home. Using a different source for them can be an option. And then consider home water treatment. Water softening is a great way to lessen the level of manganese. And most people have water softeners already in their homes. Some carbon pitchers work. And then, of course, distillation is a good option as well. So finding where to test. So we have an updated sheet of accredited labs in the state on our website. So this one's from 2020. We have a recent one from 2024. But you can also ask a public health lab in your area. They may have testing availability, or your Water Conservation District may be able to screen you for nitrates. And so if you're looking to test for all five, there are certified labs throughout the state that can help you with that. And then collecting the water sample. So really using the faucet that you drink out of most is the best one to take the sample from, right? Because that's where you're getting most of your water for consumption. You can take the water sample before and after treatment. So that is, if you do have a reverse osmosis system already, that's a really great way to see if your system is functioning properly. Um, remove that faucet screen. So on most kitchen faucets, there's a little cap at the end. Unscrew that. There's a little rubber washer. Take that off of there. You can either flame the faucet or you can disinfect with alcohol for a little bit. That really kills the bacteria that's in that space that can contaminate your sample and give you a false positive. And then run the cold water for about 5 minutes. So it does take a while, but really we want the sample from what's in your well, not just sitting in your tap during the day. So that's how you would do that. And then most accredited labs, if you do get a sample water sample kit from them, they will provide instructions.
Mhm.
All right. How can I help ensure safe drinking water? So really thinking about these contamination points for groundwater. So we talked about the broken or inadequate wellhead construction, making sure that is all sealed up tight, nothing can get in there. That's really helpful. For lead, again, looking at the plumbing, what you have in your house, maybe you have an older home, and then plumbing cross contamination or cross connection. So making sure everything's done by a licensed plumber, so nothing can backflow back into your well. That would not be great. So just looking out for these things in your home every once in a while would be a good idea. And then here's how you maybe can remember about your private well is tips. So test your water, inspect your well, protect your well, and then seal any unused wells. And again, where can you get information on your well? So we talked about that well ID tag that should have a little code on there, a ID number for your well. If you don't have that, you can try to find some more information on the Minnesota Well Index. So it is an interactive map. You can go on this website, you can scroll in, scroll out, try to find your address, and there may be some information on there about your well, how deep it was, when it was constructed, by whom, some of those types of things. Um, and this was really for wells established after 1974. And then again, it took us a little while to get in the groove of things and reporting. So if you don't find your information on there, you can always contact a licensed well contractor and they can help you out with some of that stuff. So I will take any questions
I
from
already asked some
Miranda.
of my questions. I These are all really good reminders. I we often we like to think about the freedom that having a private well gives a landowner. You have control over your water, but at the same time, it comes with the responsibility of managing your well, maintaining it, testing. When you live within the city, again we're on city wells, usually multiple, 4 or 5 of them, and the city takes care of that for you, and they'll
Yeah.
they'll send out a yearly kind of water test report so that you can see what that water is. But the city takes on that responsibility for you. That's in your taxes. So remember, when you are on your own, you are truly on your own, and you need to be doing some of that legwork and that effort to make sure that your water is still safe for you and your family to drink.
Hmm. Absolutely. Good points. Also, if anyone has questions after this, you're welcome to contact me. My email's there. We also have a general health.privatewells@state.mn.us email inbox, and that can go to any specific person for whatever question you have. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you, Anne.
Thanks, Miranda.